Hey everybody, it's me, Pete. I am not with you in the flesh today, but I am with you in spirit, truly, because I'll be thinking about you as I drive on lonely I-5 all the way back up from Southern California. We're in Malibu this weekend, seeing my son graduate from Pepperdine. Hard to believe, but we're very excited for him and excited for what the future holds. Probably more school, but that will unfold with time. So anyway, some of you remember when we came to Crosswalk, he was just 2.5 years old, and my daughter was just 6 months old. And now they're not. They're all grown up and making their way. So anyway, thank you. That gives me pause to say thank you for all your support over the years. It's not often that preachers' kids want anything to do with church or the faith. But because you've been so gracious toward me and supportive of me and our family over the years, they love the church. They love Crosswalk. They love you, and they love God, and they love faith. And that's been a team effort. So thank you so much for your support over the years. It really is a team thing, and I deeply appreciate it. So we're talking about a very touchy, sensitive, personal subject over the next 3 weeks. This series, which we kick off today, is called The Stuff of Life. And it's dealing with our stuff. How do we relate to our stuff as Jesus followers? And that means we're talking about, because we live in our culture, materialism, consumerism, which is kind of a new phenomenon. You may not realize that, but consumerism as a phenomenon is really only about 60 years old and largely started in our country. And so we're going to be taking a look at that in terms of a defined moment in history and how it's impacted us. And we'll get to that in just a second. By the way, if you guys checked out the new Samsung Galaxy phone, I've been a Galaxy user for a long time. That thing looks pretty sweet. Now, my son got me to switch over to the latest iPhone, so I think I'm using the XS, which is kind of fitting because it is kind of excessive. And it does all kinds of stuff. But I'm wondering if any of you have gotten that new Galaxy, how it might match up to my iPhone. It's pretty sweet. What kind of phone are you using, by the way? I know I'm kind of wasting time here, but just out of curiosity, are you using a smartphone right now, or are you using a dumb phone? I know at least one of you out there, Carrie Nuccio, is still using a dumb phone. Congratulations on that. But just curious, what kind of phone you use, and what kind of phone would you like to use? You happy with the phone you have, or maybe there's something better out there? I don't know. Well, maybe you could talk to me about that when I get back. Anyway, off track. So my wife grew up in the Wheaton households. Now, her maiden name was Carlson, but her mother's maiden name was Wheaton. And the Wheaton clan in Kansas, particularly my mother-in-law's father, was known for a particular character trait, which he developed from living through the Great Depression in the United States. Now, this would have been my grandfather-in-law, if that's a thing. I met him. I knew him briefly. He passed not long after we were married, and he was a very interesting guy. He was not cantankerous. He was kind of a jokester. He was a simple guy, lived a faithful life. He drove a bread truck and would drive all around. I think it was rainbow bread. And he would truck around all parts of his little neck of the woods in Kansas. And that's where they did their life. And that's where they raised my mother-in-law. And one of the things about Lawrence Wheaton, that was his name, was he was undeniably cheap. I mean, cheap. This guy was tight with a nickel. I'm a Dutchman. That's my heritage, my ethnic heritage. He wasn't Dutch, but he sure could have been, because this guy was tight with a nickel. One of the jokes that Lynn tells about him and their cheapness was for Mother's Day, Lawrence would take out Fern, my grandmother-in-law, who passed a number of years ago, out to dinner after church. They were faithful church attenders and were very generous, as much as a cheap guy can be at that time anyway. And he would take her out. I mean, it's Mother's Day after all, and she produced 3 kids. And so, hey, she's deserving of a fine lunch after church. And so they went to Arby's, the place for meats, for sandwiches, and because he was so thrifty, when they went there for lunch, he brought his own plastic cups. I'm not kidding. His own plastic cups, not solo cups, like you use for fraternity, keggers or something, but the kind that hold up after a while. And they wouldn't necessarily be Arby's cups. They might be from McDonald's or Burger King. And they'd be other fast food restaurants' cups that he would bring into the Arby's where they were having their Mother's Day lunch. And the reason he did that was because he was so cheap. He knew that he could buy one soda using his cup, which you could get refills on, and then he'd fill the rest of the sodas with ice, and he would, with that one soda, have everybody drink. Now, he was kind of up in years, and everybody kind of knew him at this Arby's. I mean, that's where he went on Mother's Day, and they didn't want to ruin that tradition or lose that business. And so they just kind of let him get away with it. But that is a cheap man. You don't even want to pay for the sodas for your wife and yourself and your children. I mean, hats off to that guy. I think that's pretty impressive. Well, he grew up in the Great Depression. If you've ever known anybody who grew up in that era, you learned it the hard way, and you were not wasteful because you couldn't afford to be wasteful. And most of the folks in our congregation that really grew up in that era have passed on. There are a few of us left, few of them left. I'm not one of them. And they just bring a different mindset to the game. And actually they bring a different character and strength to the game. I think when you hear about the greatest generation that Brokaw kind of made famous, that's who I'm thinking of. And they were formed in that time of great challenge in our country. And it had deep impact on their character, the way they saw the world, the way they saw community, the way they saw our country. And that, you don't form that just anywhere. Well, so they had a thriftiness about them, I think, as a whole generation that's largely been lost in our present culture. And because we're talking a little about money and our relationship with stuff and material possessions, some of you might be thinking, oh, great, this is a 3-week pitch to support Crosswalk. I mean, good grief, let's just check out and come back when the God Can't series come back, because that will be worthwhile. In fact, I was having a conversation just a few months ago with a crosswalker, and he had a great question for me, and it was completely valid. And I'm sure not just his question, even though he was sparring with me, I think, more than anything else, but is the question the culture would ask. Over the years here, we've offered classes on financial stewardship, how to organize your money and be smarter with your money. And he played a little bit of devil's advocate with me. He says, well, as soon as I saw you guys were offering a money management class, I was like, okay, this is just to get a little bit more money in the plate for the church, just to keep the business going. That's a fair thing, and that's a fair criticism. And actually in our culture, which has, frankly, over the last generation, gotten sick and tired of the churches asking for money all the time, it's fair. Now, I hope you realize at Crosswalk, even though we ask for money and we're very grateful for it, we are extremely subtle about it. And we mention it, we share our gratitude every week, and we appreciate every bit of support that we get. But we're hardly pushy on that. I think that's fair to say. But here's the thing I want you to get. And I want you to lower your defenses a little bit with me, if you can, on this subject. We're going to take a look at something that Jesus taught about money. He had a lot to say about our relationship with our stuff. Jesus did not have a church. Jesus was an itinerant preacher, but most of the time when he was doing his work, he was in the northern part of the country, which is home, which is where the disciples had their businesses. And my hunch is for a lot of the time when they weren't doing a gig in whatever community, the disciples continued on in their business. So I want you to think about that for a minute. When Jesus is talking about our relationship with our stuff and our money, he is not thinking about brick and mortar and keeping the lights on and paying staff and providing ministry support and all that stuff. He is talking about something much more important. He's talking about our person, our soul, about how our relationship with our stuff, with our material wealth and possessions, and how we do with our money, all of that is a deep part of us that shapes us for good or for bad. And so when he offers his wisdom, he's speaking into something much bigger than just keeping the lights on at church. Are we grateful for support? Do we need money? Yeah, we do. But personally, my feeling is we'll see with this series, if we get our head and our hearts on in a healthy way that Jesus describes, that's going to take care of itself. So right up front, this is not some kind of a bait and switch, like I'm sucking you in just so I can hit you hard in a couple weeks. That's not what this is about. Supporting Crosswalk is important, but this is much deeper than that. This is about who you are. This is about what matters to you and how we understand ourselves, not just as ourselves, but as people related to a much larger interconnected whole. And that's where we're going to go today. So we're looking at a parable today that Jesus told out of Luke chapter 22. And this is going to come up on screen here in just a second, and you can follow along with me. So he's doing some teaching, and this is how the story goes. I'm reading out of the Message version, as you can see. So someone out of the crowd said, "Teacher, order my brother to give me a fair share of the family inheritance." And he replied, "Mister, what makes you think it's any of my business to be a judge or mediator for you?" So just a quick thing here while you're looking at this and thinking about this. Back in the day, there were some fairly basic rules in terms of how inheritance would go. The oldest son in the family would get twice as much as the other sons and be in charge of the estate, and the other sons, males, would get whatever was left equally divided. If there were no sons, then it would go to the daughters. And so what this guy is saying to Jesus, he's obviously not the oldest son, and he feels like he's being treated poorly. And we don't know who's greedy here. If it's this guy asking Jesus for this help to go to a higher authority to get on his brother, or if the brother, in fact, the oldest son, we assume, is the greedy one. But you need to understand that the context into which Jesus is speaking with this parable is greed. Okay, let's get back to this thing. So speaking to the people, he went on, "Take care. Protect yourself against the least bit of greed. Life is not defined by what you have, even when you have a lot." Then he told them this story. "The farm of a certain rich man produced a terrific crop. He talked to himself, 'What can I do? My barn isn't big enough for this harvest.' Then he said, 'Here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll gather in all my grain and goods, and I'll say to myself, Self, you've done well. You've got it made and can now retire. Take it easy and have the time of your life.' Just then God showed up and said, 'Fool, tonight you die, and your barn full of goods. Who gets it?' That's what happens when you fill your barn with self and not with God." That's a penetrating story. And one of the things I thought of right away when I read this parable of Jesus is kind of a bit of relief in a very strange, weird way. In our culture, we talk a lot about consumerism and materialism, and we all know we shouldn't be, and all these shoulds that are piled onto us, and we should be more generous, and we feel like, oh, this is the problem of our time and all that. But get this is 2,000 years ago, and this was a serious problem. In fact, just so you have a little bit of perspective, you know what one of the biggest topics in the whole Bible is? Much more than prayer, much more than love, it's money. So now we're going way back before the first century. We're going back to deep antiquity. So let's just say for the last 4,000 years, because that sort of reflects the biblical history up till now, for the last 4,000 years, humanity has had a deep problem with how we think and relate to money and wealth and possessions and materials and greed. And so, in a weird way, we can take a sigh of relief because it's not just us. And yet, in a different way, we need to be very sober about this because we recognize that this is a deep part of us. This is an issue that all humanity faces and, frankly, always will. And you and I are going to struggle with this issue all the time. So let's unpack this story a little bit and just see some of the things that are happening and recognize why this parable is brilliant and why we're going to spend a little bit of time on it over the next few weeks, referring back to this probably again and again. So first thing you need to know is you got this farmer here. If you've ever known any farmers, they are some of the most hardest working people you're ever going to meet. Particularly crops are, if they're farming crops, that's one thing. If they are dealing with livestock, it's another game. I had a farmer in my old church in Illinois. He did both. He did corn and beans. Those were his crops. And then he was a pig farmer to boot. Tell you what, man, you don't know anybody who works harder than that guy. This guy is up way before dawn because apparently pigs like to eat and they want to be fed. And so he has to take care of them. And then he's got to deal with his crops. And then harvest comes. And I mean, it's nuts. These guys work so hard and have to work so smart with what they do. It's just a whole different game. But it's always been hard work. So you got a guy here. So right out of the gate, we know this guy's a hard worker. So he's not a lazy guy. And he's done his part to have a great crop. So aware of that. He didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, I wonder if I've got crops on my land. No, this means that this guy took the time and the effort to prepare the soil at one time, many months before, threw the seed out there as you do, and waited. So he did his good hard work that set the stage for a good crop. However, there are some things that he did not do to ensure that he got a bumper crop. And I think this is really important for us to hear. In our arrogance, this guy did not command the sun to come up on time every day. This guy did not command rain to come down from the heavens. This guy did not control the thermostat of creation to make sure that the conditions were ideal for him to have a bumper crop. Those things were out of his control. You know what the reality is? That if you and I are living in this country, we have been given a great gift that we personally, probably for most of you, you did not orchestrate. You did not choose who you were born to. You did not choose the zip code that you were in. If you are a hard worker, wonderful. But what you may not realize that there are extenuating circumstances and variables way beyond your control that have attributed to your success or your lack of success. We can take responsibility for the things that we do really good and hard work toward. But we have to be honest, there are situations, there are circumstances out of our control. This guy forgot that. As far as this farmer was concerned, this was his crop. It was only him. What a hard, wonderful worker he was. What a miracle worker that this guy had such an abundant crop. Well done. Well, already out of the gate, we recognize this guy is forgetting that there are a whole lot of other variables that came into play that contributed to his success in that particular year. As the story goes on, he recognizes right away his crop is so big, his barns can't hold it, which means that his barns, which had been good all up until this point, had been plenty big for other big crops, but not quite this big a crop. He's going to have bigger barns, which tells us another thing. Be aware that the culture that we're talking to here is not the United States of America, and it's not Napa, California. Here's the thing, Napa, California, if you are hungry, that's awful. That tells a greater story than just about your empty belly. It infers hardship and it infers struggle and probably some really difficult chapters in your story. But if you go hungry in Napa, that's problematic because there are many avenues through which you can get food. One of them is CrossWalk. Another is the table. Another is Salvation Army. There are many routes to go to make sure that you have food on the table in Napa. Jesus didn't live and breathe in Napa. That's not where he did his ministry, and it wasn't 2019 when he was doing his ministry either. He was living and breathing in a time where abject poverty was the norm. In fact, Jesus was so poor personally that I'm certain there were times in his life where he wasn't sure if he was going to eat that day, and I'm certain there were many days of his life where he did not eat. So we're talking about a different culture. We talk about the 99% and the 1%. That's a thing. That's a reality. Well, theirs was more like 99.9% and 0.1%. If the 0.1% was even a small enough number. The overwhelming number of people who lived in that area at that time were extremely poor. There was extreme hunger that no doubt existed among people in that day. It's an arid climate. It's Mediterranean, sure, but it's a desert-like environment. I've been there, and it's not Central California. It's not the lush fields of the Midwest in the United States. It's not that. And so if you have a guy who has this bumper crop, and he already has barns big enough for every year up until that point, and he says to himself, what am I going to do with all this extra food? I have to tear down these old barns and spend the money that requires and build up brand new barns, all the money that requires, because that's the only thing I can think of doing. At this point, anybody in the audience is thinking, this guy is the biggest jerk we've ever heard about, because he surely knows that there are people all around him who are truly hungry. And he's thinking about building bigger barns. What a selfish jerk. So either he does know about it and doesn't care, or he is so self-consumed and self-preoccupied that he doesn't even recognize there's anybody else on the planet to worry about except himself. So that's something we need to look at. So he does it. And in his mind, well, he doesn't actually do it. It's all parable. It's all metaphor. It's all for our imagination and all for our intrigue and interest and coloring this thing out however we like. But the way this thing goes, he's thinking to himself, I'm going to build these massive barns. It's going to be great. I'm going to say to myself, I've finally saved enough. I'm going to retire and do whatever the heck I want for the rest of my life because I have enough money for myself. Now, we need to take pause here for a moment because we should probably feel a little bit uncomfortable at this point. And if you're not feeling a little uncomfortable, I'm wondering where you're watching this from. Because if you live in the United States, we have very clear ideas about how things should go if things are going well. And part of the American dream is not just the pursuit of happiness, but part of that dream is that you work your years, and then once you hit that retirement age, you can do whatever you want. You've got all the money. That's the dream. You got enough money to live on your own and do whatever for the rest of your life. And if you bounce your last check, well, okay. In fact, one theologian, one church leader, for different reasons, said, I hope I bounce my last check. In other words, I hope I spend it all before I go. But that's not necessarily how we think about it. In our culture, we highly esteem the capacity for potentially the last third of our life and potentially for half of our adult life to kick back and put our feet up and retire. I should be ticking you off a little bit right now because some of you are thinking, wait a minute, don't take away my retirement. Don't give me crap for that because I've worked hard for that. And you have. But what I'm saying is this is a moment to recognize that we have a cultural difference here between us and the first century. And we do have a phenomenon. There is a tension already in play, and it's exacerbated by the culture we live in of how do we understand what is balance, how do we deal with this tension? And if you've never thought about the tension, well, I'm probably ruining your day right now. And that's okay. Because the good news is Jesus is giving us a picture of something, a healthy way to live, which not only blesses us, is good for us, but also takes others into consideration so that it's a win across the board. Interesting stuff. One thing that's super clear in this passage, the guy's only thinking about himself. If you notice the language going by as it was on the screen, is it's my crops, it's my barn, it's myself, it's my future. It's all about him. There's no regard for all the people around him who undoubtedly, some of those could use a lot of help and need help and maybe just had bad luck that year and they're going hungry while he's building bigger barns. And there's also no awareness on this guy's part that there is a greater other at play to seek out for guidance, to seek out for wisdom. This guy is, as far as we can tell, he is a practical atheist. He's just thinking about what makes sense to me, myself, and I. And there's no greater other. There's nothing bigger than me in the world at play that I need to take into consideration. A lot of us live our lives that way. By the way, this isn't going to be a series where I should on you a lot. That's should on you, SHOULD. I'm not going to should on you throughout this whole series. Thank you, Lauren and Lisa Haas, by the way, for that clever little quip. It's not about that, but it is about asking ourselves if we're serious about this Jesus following stuff, if we're serious about our faith, do we look to God for insight on who we are and how we're to operate on something that is so personal as our money and so protected as our stuff? Because we live in a culture that pushes us all the time to spend more, to buy more. When Lynn and I were living in the Midwest, we had a modest home. It was a nice home, but it was a modest home in central Illinois, like northern central Illinois. It was an old house, 1895, I think, is when it was built. Pretty much restored, cool place. But it was built in 1895 with 1895 sensibilities. So there wasn't a master bedroom. We had 3 bedrooms upstairs, and we shared 1 full bathroom up there, which wasn't a big deal when you got a 6-month-old and a 2.5-year-old. We had to work around each other, getting ready in the morning, but no big deal. But when we had company, that became a little challenging. So as we were thinking of moving to California and wondering what kind of place we would get, we both kind of dreamt of, it would be nice to have, especially as the kids get older, a master bedroom with a master bath. And so that kind of came out of our mouth. Well, if only we could have a place with a master bedroom and a master bath. And lo and behold, we found such a place. Now, our house is nice. I love how Lynn decorates and all that stuff, but it's not big. I mean, our house is 1,600 square feet, a little under that. And we got our master bedroom with our master bath, and Lynn got her closet and that kind of a thing. And I got my tiny bit of a closet. That's another thing for another day. But anyway, we got our master bath. But you know what happens in our culture? Newer homes pop up all around us all the time. And you know what? They're nicer than ours, and they're bigger than ours. And when we go into those, there are things that we see like, oh, I sure wish we had that feature, or I wish we had a little more space like that, or I wish we could have a bigger dining area so we could have people over more and it would be more comfortable than what we've got. These kind of things go through our mind because we live in a culture that constantly bombards us with stuff. So just a curious question for you. The place you're living, is it your dream place? Or if you could live any place you want, what would it look like? Or maybe even just a little bit better place than where you are. What would that look like? What kinds of things would you like to see different in the place where you live? Or how about the car you drive? I know last week I was bragging a lot about my 2003 Honda Odyssey with 185,000 miles, which we took to Southern California, by the way, and hopefully it's still in good repair and on its way back as I'm speaking to you right now. And I'm sure all of you wish you had a 2003 Honda Odyssey, but you can't because it's mine unless you want to buy mine. But if you can't have mine, what kind of car do you wish you did have? Is there a model out there, maybe a newer model of what you have or a different kind of car altogether that you wish you had? Here's the thing, in our culture, you are constantly bombarded with invitations to dream about something better. And when those invitations to dream about something better show up on our screens, you're reminded of what you don't have. But this idea of consumerism, of wanting to create a need and a desire, even for something new, even though what you have is okay. That is a new phenomenon that really showed up in our country post World War II. The industry changed at that point, and we recognized that we were changing as a culture into a consumer driven culture. That was going to be our engine as a culture. And so the marketing behind that shifted at that same time. If you feel bombarded with ads from all kinds of things, from cars to phones to vacations to pharmaceuticals, you should, because that's the culture that we live in. A number of years ago, when the kids were little, we took a camping trip. It was our first camping trip to Yosemite, except we didn't know that you had to like book that camping trip like a year in advance if you actually wanted to camp in Yosemite. So we camped outside of Yosemite at a KOA. Now, KOAs, I don't know if it really qualifies as camping, honestly. It's more of a fancy parking lot with hookups and all this kind of stuff. And we never really got into the hookup kind of camping. We like to rough it a little bit. We're state parker kind of people. And so, and our camper at that time, we sold it last year, but it was one of these things where the beds pop out. It's a hybrid kind of a thing where, well, anyway, it's more of a tent camper type thing, but not quite as rough as a tent camper. So we pull in our lane with our little tent camper. And if you've ever been to a KOA, you realize there aren't too many tent campers around, because the people who camp in a KOA are people who like to camp on a little more luxurious scale. So we have our thing all set up. And before too long, here comes this diesel pusher that comes in right next door to us and our little 18-foot tent camper. And just for contrast, ours brand new, might sell for $15,000, and you can buy them used. I sold it for like $3,000 or something like that. These diesel pushers, like this one that came up, and this sucker was only a couple years old, we're talking $150,000, $200,000. I mean, this is some serious dollars driving around on the interstate. I don't even know why they call it camping. I mean, give me a break, man. This thing's a luxurious condo on wheels. But because I'm me, I get to talking to this guy, and we're talking about things, and he's proud of his diesel pusher, as he should be. It's a cool ride. Oh, whatever. I'm not judging the guy. But what I am saying is the conversation that we had, he was saying, I started off like you, and I started off with a little camper, and we had that, and we enjoyed that. But then we got, a bigger camper and a bigger camper, and now we have this. And we progressed in time. Now, the intimation of what he was saying to me was, you're not there yet, Pete, but you can progress to this. In other words, you're nowhere near there, but someday maybe this could be yours. And at that moment, I was a little uncomfortable, feeling a little sheepish about my 18-foot tent camper, but not really, because that's not what I wanted to do with my family. We wanted to be in it, be in the surroundings. But what it was a reminder for me was the culture that we live in, that what we have is not enough. And if you're really paying attention, then you should always want more. And that happens in real estate. It happens with our cars. The reason I asked you about phones at the beginning of this thing was because our phones are a great example of that reality, of constantly having to upgrade to keep up with it, and planned obsolescence plays into that. So our phones don't work so well. The battery doesn't last as long after a couple of years. We got to upgrade it. It's this continual cycle. I have a friend that bought a beautiful home in a gated community, and hey, God bless him. I mean, he works hard, and he got this beautiful home. But there was a little bit of a sense, and I know in him, and I know his backstory. I mean, it's just this incredible rags to riches story, and I'm really proud of my friend for what he's accomplished with his life. But there is a little bit of Americana and American dream that I know is at work. Like, well, I've now arrived. I'm there because I have the right address, and that's a tension that exists in our American psyche. And a friend of mine who was with me looking at this grand home, and it's gorgeous, and I love it. It's wonderful, and I'm happy. I'm truly happy for him, truly. But my friend, his comment was, "Well, I thought our house was impressive, but now, I'm not so sure anymore." And I think that speaks more to the culture that we live in than anything else. That our culture conditions us to not be satisfied with what we have, to think mostly about ourselves and building our own personal kingdoms, and not thinking so broadly as Jesus is challenging with this passage. Now, one of the worst things I did for the American dream in my life was go to Kenya. And Lynn kind of knew she was in trouble when I got back from visiting the slums for the first time. And she was talking about how, it'd be nice to have a little bit more space. And that's true. Sometimes this place gets a little tight. It's not a big house, and we step on each other now. Not with just the two of us here, obviously, but when family's here and all that stuff. But anyway, she was talking about, oh, I just wish I had a little bit more kitchen space. And I was just back from Kenya. And I was like, give me a break. 8 to 12 people live in a home the size of our kitchen, where they do everything in that space. And they don't have running water, and they have to sleep in there on dilapidated furniture, and they work on a coal stove. I mean, I don't want to hear it, So my attitude was pretty rough that way. But we kind of need that shakeup now and again to wake us up to the game that we're in and the way we've been gamed and the way we've been played. And this passage, this parable from Jesus, is right to that, because the way the parable ends is this guy has his big plans and he's dreaming about the luxurious life he's going to have for himself. And what happens? He dies. And God comes to him and says, hey, fool. I mean, isn't that interesting? This guy's called a fool by God. That's not something you want to be called by God. But God calls this guy, hey, fool. Now what's going to happen? Now what's going to happen to your precious grain and your big barns? You're not going to enjoy it. It's what's going to happen? It's no longer entrusted to you. And that means so much to think about in terms of what that means for our resources. It means that this guy never got to see the mouths that could have been fed if he'd have just shared his excess grain, which his own biblical tradition would have told him to do. It has to do with gleaning the crops and leaving some for the poor. Well, this guy wasn't leaving anything for the poor to glean. It was all about him. And so this guy's never going to get the satisfaction and the joy of seeing mouths fed because he chose to be generous. He's never going to appreciate the depths and the interrelatedness of creation, and that we are entrusted with certain things only to entrust more to other people. He's not going to tap into the Spirit of God on a certain level because God is forever generous and gracious and giving. And if that is true of the Spirit of God, then when we choose not to be generous and giving with our stuff and sharing with our stuff and thinking beyond ourselves, if we choose not to tie into that Spirit, what we're really saying is we are choosing not to tie in with God. We're not wanting to be in relationship with God on that line. If this is one of the biggest issues of our day, if this is one of the things that commands more attention in us and causes more worry, which it does in our lives, what are we to take away from that? If we're saying on this massive issue, we are choosing not to be in relationship with God or not to pay attention to what God has for us. Jesus is simply saying right here and now that it's between the lines, but it's also right in front of us. Hey, you who have much, who have worked hard for all that you have, way to go on that. First, be aware. It's not just your hard work that made you who you are. A lot of factors contributed to your success if you are successful. For those of you who feel like you earned it all on your hard work, that's not true. There were contributing factors that all played a role. People in your lives before you whose shoulders you are standing on, the culture that you live on, the time in history that you lived, the zip code in which you worked. All of these things work together. Economic trend, all of this stuff works together to contribute to the success that you may have had. Be aware. Your hard work matters, but your success is not just because of your hard work. So first, step back and wake up and realize it's not all about you. And secondly, when we start using my language, like, what am I going to do with my stuff? What am I going to do with my money? We immediately set ourselves up for a disconnect with God, because we do not live in isolation. We live as a global community, and there are people around us who need help. And as for some people especially, all the hard work in the world isn't going to make that much difference. You want to see what hard work looks like? You come to Kenya with me next year. You take a look at these folks in the slum and just see how easy it is to live in the slum. They're working all the time, even when they're not working. That's a whole different kind of work. I invite you to try it out. We live in a global community where not everybody has the same opportunity as everybody else, where you can have two people side by side working just as hard, and one might make it and one might not. It is incumbent on us, because it is the nature of God, to look at our situation, look at who we are, what we have, and decide, how are we going to be like God? How are we going to tie into the Spirit of God, who is other-centered, who is aware of the needs around us, and is willing to do their part to help out with that need? Because that's a key part of what we're going to be looking at in this series, is how do we manage our stuff? How do we get our heads around this so that, one, our needs are taken care of, which we're not asked to starve, but how do we manage our relationship with our stuff so that our relationship with God is intact? We are able to do what we need to provide for ourselves and others, our loved ones. And then how are we going to contribute to the bigger world that's at play? What are we going to do with that? Those are some of the things that we're going to look at today. But for now, I just want to mess with you. And I just want you to think about these issues, about what does it mean to be in relationship with stuff. As you think about your material possessions, what kinds of things go through your mind? And is there any part of you that looks something like this wealthy farmer? Who, instead of thinking how he could share his excess, chose instead to build bigger barns for himself. I pray that God will mess with you just about that this week, and just help you start asking questions perhaps about what goes into your thinking process when you think about your relationship with material possessions. Jesus, in another passage, famously said, you cannot serve two masters. You're going to serve one or the other. And his context for that, he sums up, he says, you cannot serve money and God. One of those is going to win out. Well, my prayer for us as we go through this series together is first to take stock. How have we been formed by our culture to constantly want more and more and more and better and newer and bigger as a sign of our self-worth, as a statement to the culture of our success? How have we been played on that? And how are we open to the tension that God might present to us about how we might live differently, that is actually better for ourselves, for our own wholeness and health, integrates us with the whole world around us, and makes a lasting contribution to the world in which we live? That's our hope. To close this week and the next 2 weeks at least, I want us to close with the Lord's Prayer. And so I invite you to close this teaching of mine, and we'll say this together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Hope you guys have a great week. Hope this messes with you a whole lot. No apologies there. Sorry, not sorry. And we will see you Wednesday if you come to Praxis. And if not, I will see you next Sunday. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.